The dust clouds of 1885 Colorado territory swirled around Martha's worn boots as she stood at the edge of Millfield, watching the sheriff point his rifle toward the horizon. "Keep moving, lady. We don't want your kind here." Her 3 boys, ages 6, 8, and 10, clutched her tattered skirts, their hollow eyes reflecting weeks of rejection from town after town. What none of these people knew was that Martha wasn't just any desperate widow. She was the daughter of a notorious outlaw, and the bounty hunters trailing her family's blood money were getting closer every day. When the last door slammed in her face, she thought they'd die on the prairie. Then Ezekiel Stone appeared like a mirage, his Mormon settlement rising from the valley below. "You're home now," he said simply, but Martha saw something dangerous flicker in his kind eyes, a recognition that made her blood run cold. Did this stranger somehow know exactly who she was running from? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared into Ezekiel Stone's weathered face. His dark beard was streaked with silver, and his broad shoulders filled out a simple brown coat that had seen better days. Behind him, the settlement spread across the valley like something from a dream. Neat wooden houses, cultivated fields, and smoke rising peacefully from stone chimneys. "I don't understand," she whispered, glancing nervously at the sheriff who still watched them from Millfield's main street. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." Ezekiel's grey eyes softened as he looked down at her sons. Little Samuel, only 6, had his thumb in his mouth, a habit he'd developed since his father died. 8-year-old Jacob stood protective and defiant, while 10-year-old Matthew kept scanning the horizon with the wariness of someone far too young to understand such vigilance. "I know enough," Ezekiel said quietly. "I know you're running from something that ain't your fault. I know these boys need a roof and regular meals, and I know the Lord don't smile on folks who turn away the desperate." Martha pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and something else, bread baking, perhaps, or stew simmering. When was the last time she'd smelled home cooking? Her stomach twisted with longing and suspicion in equal measure. "There are things you should know about us," she began, but Ezekiel held up a calloused hand. "There are things you should know about us too," he replied. "We're Mormons, Latter-day Saints if you prefer. Some folks got strong opinions about that. But we believe in taking care of our own, and as of this moment, you're our own." The word "our" sent an unexpected warmth through Martha's chest. How long had it been since she belonged somewhere, since she and the boys were part of something larger than their desperate flight across the territories? "Mama," Samuel tugged at her skirt. "I'm hungry." The simple words nearly broke her. They'd shared the last of their hardtack that morning, and her coin purse held exactly 17 cents, not enough for a meal, let alone lodging. Ezekiel crouched down to Samuel's eye level. "Well now, that's easily fixed. Sister Brigham, that's my neighbor's wife. She makes the finest apple butter this side of Salt Lake City. You think you might like some on fresh bread?" Samuel's eyes went wide, and he nodded solemnly. Even Jacob and Matthew perked up, though they tried to hide their interest. "There's just one condition," Ezekiel continued, standing and addressing Martha directly. "No more running. Whatever's chasing you, we face it together. That's how we do things in New Canaan." New Canaan. Even the name sounded like sanctuary. But Martha knew better than to trust in promised lands. Her father's blood ran in her veins, and blood like that had a way of bringing trouble to innocent people. "You don't understand what you're offering," she said. "The kind of danger—" "I understand plenty about danger," Ezekiel interrupted, and for just a moment, something hard and cold flashed across his features. Then the kindness returned, but Martha had seen enough violence in her life to recognize its echo in another person's eyes. He gestured toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 bay horses. "Climb up, all of you. We'll get these boys fed and you settled, then we can talk about whatever shadows you're carrying." As Martha helped her sons into the wagon bed, she caught sight of something that made her breath catch. There, Barely visible beneath Ezekiel's coat was the worn wooden handle of a Colt revolver. The holster showed the kind of wear that came from frequent use, not mere precaution. Ezekiel Stone might present himself as a simple Mormon rancher, but Martha had grown up around dangerous men. She knew the signs. The question was whether his secrets would prove more dangerous than the bounty hunters still tracking her across the territories. As the wagon rolled toward New Canaan, Martha held her boys close and wondered if they were finally finding salvation or walking straight into another kind of trap entirely. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the muddy street as Sarah guided the horses toward the general store. Millfield looked no different from the last 3 towns. Weathered buildings, suspicious eyes tracking their movement, and the familiar tightness in her chest that came with knowing she'd soon be turned away again. "Ma, I'm hungry." Thomas, her youngest at 5, pressed against her side, while his brothers sat silent in the back. At 7 and 9, they'd learned not to ask for what she couldn't provide. "Soon, sweetheart." The lie came easier each time. Their last coins had bought grain for the horses 2 towns back. She'd been rationing the dried beans and hardtack, but even those were nearly gone. The general store's bell chimed as she pushed through the door, Thomas clinging to her worn skirt. Behind the counter, a portly man with graying whiskers looked up from his ledger. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to poorly concealed distaste as he took in her patched dress and hollow cheeks. "Help you, ma'am? I'm looking for work. Anything, cooking, cleaning, mending. I have 3 boys who can help with chores." The man's gaze flicked toward the window where her wagon sat. She knew what he saw, everything she owned tied down with fraying rope, the desperate look of someone with nowhere left to go. "Afraid there's nothing here for folks like you." "Folks like me?" He cleared his throat, suddenly interested in his inventory sheets. "Widow woman with children. Town's got enough mouths to feed already." Heat flooded her cheeks, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I'm not asking for charity. I'll work for whatever you think fair." Like I said, nothing available. He moved toward a customer who'd just entered, a woman in a fine blue dress who pointedly avoided meeting Sarah's eyes. Outside, Sarah leaned against the wagon wheel and closed her eyes. 4 months since they'd left Kansas. 4 months of rejection, of watching her boys grow thinner, of the terrible knowledge that winter was coming and she had no plan beyond the next town. "Excuse me, ma'am." She opened her eyes to find a man approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples. His clothes were well made, but practical, and something in his manner suggested he was accustomed to being listened to. "Couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Hendricks," he said, nodding toward the store. "You're looking for work." Sarah straightened, automatically smoothing her skirt. "Yes, sir. I'm Jacob Morrison. I run a ranch about 30 miles south of here." His voice was quiet, measured. "Always need reliable help, especially someone good with cooking and household management." Hope fluttered in her chest, dangerous and desperate. "I can do both. My boys are good workers too." "How old are they?" 9, 7, and 5. He nodded, studying her face with unusual intensity. "The ranch is somewhat isolated. Might be lonely for a woman used to town life." Something flickered in his dark eyes, approval perhaps, or recognition. "The work would include cooking for my family and the hands, managing the household, some gardening, room and board provided, plus wages. Nothing extravagant, but enough to keep you and your boys comfortable." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "Your family?" "My wife passed 2 years ago. I have a daughter, 16. She's been managing things, but she needs to focus on her education." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "We live somewhat differently than most folks around here. I want to be clear about that up front." "Differently how?" "We keep to ourselves mostly. Don't socialize much in town. Some people have strong opinions about how we choose to live." The warning in his tone should have concerned her, but desperation made her reckless. What did other people's opinions matter when her children were going hungry? "Mr. Morrison, I've been turned away from every town between here and Kansas. Whatever opinions people might have about your family, they couldn't be worse than what I've already faced." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Can you be ready to travel in an hour? I'd like to get home before dark." "We're ready now." "Good. I'll handle supplies for the journey." He started to turn, then paused. "Mrs. Sarah? Sarah Blake." "Mrs. Blake. One more thing." His expression grew serious. "Once you're at the ranch, you'll be under my protection. That means following my guidance about when and where you go, especially regarding trips to town. Can you accept that?" The words should have raised alarms, but Sarah was beyond caring about propriety or independence. Her boys needed food and shelter, and this man was offering both. "I understand." "Good. I'll meet you at the livery in an hour." As he walked away, Sarah allowed herself a moment of pure relief before climbing back onto the wagon to tell her sons they were finally going home. The wagon wheels creaked a familiar rhythm against the hard-packed earth as Sarah guided the horses along the winding trail that led deeper into the valley. 3 days had passed since Jacob Whitmore's unexpected offer, and with each mile the landscape transformed from the barren scrubland they'd grown accustomed to into something that seemed almost too good to be true. Green pastures stretched between rolling hills, dotted with cattle that looked well-fed and content. A creek meandered alongside the trail, its water clear enough to see the smooth stones beneath. Thomas had stopped complaining about the heat, and even little Samuel had perked up, pointing excitedly at a red-winged blackbird that swooped low over the water. "Ma, look how green everything is," Michael said from his perch beside her on the wagon seat. At 12, he'd taken to studying their surroundings with the wariness of someone who'd learned that good things rarely lasted. "You think it's always like this?" Sarah adjusted her grip on the reins, watching Jacob Whitmore's straight-backed figure riding ahead of them. He'd barely spoken since they'd set out from town, offering only necessary directions and polite inquiries about their comfort. His silence should have been reassuring. She'd grown tired of men who felt compelled to fill every moment with talk. But something about his careful reserve made her uneasy. "I don't know, son," she replied honestly. "But it's beautiful, isn't it?" They crested a small rise, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The valley opened before them like something from a dream she'd forgotten how to have. Fields of corn and wheat swayed in the afternoon breeze, their rows straight and purposeful. A large farmhouse sat nestled among cottonwood trees, its white-painted walls bright against the green backdrop. Outbuildings dotted the property. A barn that looked sturdy enough to weather any storm, a chicken coop already bustling with activity, and what appeared to be a workshop with smoke curling lazily from its chimney. "Is that where we're going to live?" Thomas called from the back of the wagon, his 8-year-old voice filled with hope he was trying to hide. Jacob turned in his saddle, and for the first time since they'd met him, Sarah caught a glimpse of something softer in his expression. "That's home," he said simply, but she noticed how his eyes lingered on her sons' faces, as if their wonder meant something to him. As they drew closer, Sarah began to notice details that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. The fences were in good repair, the vegetable garden was laid out with mathematical precision, and the house itself was larger than anything she'd dared hope for. 2 stories with a wraparound porch and windows that sparkled in the late afternoon sun. But it was the woman who emerged from the front door that made Sarah's heart skip with sudden anxiety. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair pinned back beneath a simple white cap and a blue dress that emphasized her narrow waist. Her face was pleasant enough, though serious, and when she looked at the approaching wagon, Sarah caught a flash of something that might have been displeasure before it was quickly concealed. "That's Rebecca," Jacob said, as if sensing Sarah's unspoken question. "My wife." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Wife. Of course he had a wife. She'd been so focused on his offer of shelter, so desperate for salvation, that she'd somehow failed to consider the obvious. Heat flooded her cheeks as she realized how naive she must seem, a widow with 3 children accepting the charity of a married man without even thinking about how it might appear. "I didn't realize," she began, but Jacob was already dismounting. "Rebecca's been preparing a place for you and the boys," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The cabin behind the main house has been empty since my hired hand moved on last spring. It's small, but it should serve. A cabin. Not the big house, then." Sarah felt her son's excitement deflate slightly behind her, and she fought the urge to gather them up and keep driving. But where would they go? They had perhaps $2 left to their names, and winter wasn't far off. Rebecca approached the wagon with measured steps, her hands folded neatly at her waist. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Zion Valley." Something in the way she said it, the emphasis on the word Zion, made Sarah's skin prickle with unease. She'd heard that name before, in hushed conversations about the Mormons and their peculiar ways. But Jacob seemed like any other rancher, and she'd been too grateful for his offer to question it closely. "Thank you for your kindness," Sarah replied, climbing down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could muster. "We're very grateful." Rebecca's gaze swept over the three boys as they tumbled out of the wagon, and Sarah caught something calculating in her expression. "I'm sure we'll all adjust to the new arrangements," she said carefully. "Won't we, Jacob?" The way she said her husband's name carried a weight Sarah didn't understand, but the message was clear enough. They were guests here, tolerated but not necessarily welcome. And whatever secrets lay behind Jacob Whitmore's generous offer, Sarah suspected she was about to discover them whether she wanted to or not. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Sarah stepped onto the porch, her coffee steaming in the crisp mountain air. 3 days had passed since their arrival, and already the boys had begun to lose the haunted look that had followed them across 2 states. She watched them now, chasing chickens near the barn while Ezra showed them how to scatter feed properly. "Gentle now, Samuel," Ezra called out as her youngest lunged after a particularly fat hen. "They'll come to you if you're patient." Sarah smiled despite herself. When had any of them last had reason for such simple joy? The sound of her boys' laughter seemed foreign after months of hushed voices and fearful glances over shoulders. "Coffee strong enough to wake the dead this morning." She turned to find Ezra approaching, his own cup in hand. Up close, she noticed things about him that the desperate haze of their first meeting had obscured. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the silver threading through his dark hair at his temples, the careful distance he maintained as if he understood her need for space. "I'm not much of a cook," she admitted. "Mary always said I could burn water if left to my own devices." "Mary?" "My husband's sister. She took us in after—" Sarah's voice caught. Even now, speaking of David's death felt like swallowing glass. "After the accident. Let us stay for nearly a year before her husband decided we'd worn out our welcome." Ezra's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A year's a long time to grieve. Apparently not long enough for some folks' taste. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She'd worked so hard to bury that anger, to focus only on survival, on keeping her boys safe and fed. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the children. Samuel had finally managed to coax a hen close enough to take feed from his palm, his face bright with wonder. Thomas and David Jr. were helping each other carry a bucket of water, their small arms straining with the effort, but their determination absolute. "They're good boys," Ezra said quietly. "They are. They've been through more than any child should have to bear, and their mother's been through more than any woman should have to bear alone." Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. There was an understanding in his eyes that went beyond mere sympathy, as if he spoke from experience rather than observation. "Mr. Dalton." "Ezra, please." She nodded. "Ezra. I need you to know that we won't be a burden to you. I can work, and the boys can help with whatever needs doing around the ranch. We're not looking for charity." "I never thought you were." He studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "What I'm curious about is why a woman with 3 children would rather risk traveling alone through Colorado territory than accept help from family." The question hung between them like smoke. Sarah found herself caught between the urge to tell him everything and the instinct to protect what little dignity she had left. But there was something about Ezra Dalton that invited trust, even as her practical mind warned her against it. "Some help comes with too high a price," she said finally. "And what price would that be?" She turned away, ostensibly to check on the boys, but really to escape the probing warmth of his gaze. David's brother wanted to apprentice Thomas to a blacksmith in Kansas City, said it would be one less mouth for me to feed. David Jr. could go to their cousin's farm in Missouri, help with the harvest. Samuel, she swallowed hard. Samuel they'd allow me to keep, since he's still small enough to need a mother's care. They wanted to split up your family. For our own good, they said. I couldn't provide for 3 growing boys on my own, not proper-like. This way, each boy would have opportunities, learn trades, make something of themselves. Her hands clenched around her coffee cup, as if being together meant nothing, as if love was less important than opportunity. Ezra was quiet for so long, she wondered if she'd revealed too much, exposed too much of her desperation and stubborn pride. When she finally dared to look at him again, his expression was unreadable. "Family should stay together," he said simply. "Whatever else happens, that much shouldn't change." Something in his voice made her wonder what changes he'd endured, what family he might have lost. But before she could ask, Samuel came running toward them, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama, Mr. Dalton, the chickens like me now. They eat right from my hand." Ezra knelt down to Samuel's level, his stern features softening. "That's because you've got the makings of a fine rancher, young Samuel. Animals know when a person has a gentle heart." As she watched her youngest son beam under Ezra's praise, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. The morning air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke as Sarah stepped onto the porch, her bare feet finding the cool planks. Through the window behind her, she could see her boys still sleeping, their small forms tangled in the quilts Ezra had provided. For the first time in months, they looked peaceful. She'd been awake since before dawn, her mind churning with questions about the man who'd taken them in. Every instinct told her to be grateful and ask nothing more, but years of hardship had taught her that kindness always came with a price. The sound of boots on gravel made her turn. Ezra emerged from the barn, carrying a pail of milk, his movements efficient and purposeful. He'd already fed the livestock and gathered eggs, while she'd lain listening to her children's steady breathing. "You're up early," he said, climbing the steps. His voice was softer than it had been the night before, less guarded. "I couldn't sleep." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I keep thinking this is too good to be true." Something flickered across his features, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a familiar feeling. He set the milk pail down and leaned against the porch rail, studying the horizon where the mountains caught the first light. "I used to think the same thing about this place," he said finally. "Kept waiting for something to go wrong. And did it?" His silence stretched long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Wrong is probably too simple a word for it. Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of running feet came from inside the house. Tommy burst through the door, his hair sticking up in all directions, followed closely by the twins. "Ma, there's horses!" Tommy's eyes were bright with excitement. Real horses, not like the old nag we had before. "Mind your manners," Sarah chided, but Ezra was already crouching down to Tommy's level. "Would you like to see them up close?" he asked. "After breakfast, I could show you how to brush them properly." Tommy nodded eagerly, and even the usually shy twins pressed closer. Sarah watched the interaction with a mixture of gratitude and unease. It had been so long since a man had shown interest in her children, had offered them anything beyond grudging tolerance. "Mr. Thorne," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice her concerns without seeming ungrateful. "Ezra," he corrected, straightening, "and whatever you're thinking, you can say it plain. I've got thick skin." She glanced at the boys, who had wandered to the edge of the porch to peer at the chickens pecking in the yard. "I need to know what you expect from us, what this arrangement really is. You need a place to stay. I've got room. His answer was too simple, too clean. Men don't usually offer help without wanting something in return. A shadow passed over his face, and for a moment she thought she glimpsed something deeper. Pain, maybe, or regret. Maybe I'm not like most men you've known. Maybe. Or maybe you're just better at hiding what you want. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, born from too many disappointed hopes and broken promises. She expected him to be offended, to show his true colors, but instead he nodded slowly. "You're right to be careful," he said. "A woman alone has to be. But I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give. Room and board for help around the place, nothing more. And when winter comes, when the work gets scarce. Winter's when the work gets harder, not scarcer. There's wood to cut, animals to tend, repairs to make." He paused, studying her face. "You planning to run again when the first snow falls?" The question caught her off guard. She'd spent so long thinking only about the next day, the next town, the next rejection, that she hadn't dared imagine staying anywhere long enough to see seasons change. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead in a long time. Might be good to try," he said quietly. "Thinking ahead, I mean. Making plans that stretch further than just surviving today." Tommy came running back, pulling at Ezra's sleeve. "Can we see the horses now, please?" Ezra looked to Sarah, waiting for her permission. The simple courtesy of it, the acknowledgement that she was still their mother and the one who made decisions about their welfare, nearly undid her. After breakfast, she managed. "And after you helped me with the dishes." Tommy groaned but nodded, already running inside to wake his brothers properly. Sarah watched him go, then turned back to find Ezra studying her with those careful eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for asking first." He nodded, understanding more than she'd said. "We'll take this one day at a time, Mrs. Coleman. No pressure, no expectations beyond honest work and fair treatment. That acceptable to you?" For the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah felt something that might have been hope taking root in her chest. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Ezra work with her boys in the corral. 3 days had passed since their arrival, and already she could see changes in her sons. Tommy's shoulders had lost some of their rigid tension, and even little Pete had begun to venture beyond her skirts without constant reassurance. But it was Samuel who concerned her most. Her middle son had taken to following Ezra everywhere, hanging on his every word with the desperate hunger of a boy starved for a father figure. Sarah understood the need. God knew they'd all felt the absence of masculine guidance, but something about Ezra's easy acceptance of Samuel's devotion unsettled her. "Ah, look!" Pete's voice carried across the yard as he successfully mounted the gentle mare Ezra had chosen for him. The pride in his small face made Sarah's heart clench. When was the last time she'd seen any of her children truly smile? A knock at the front door pulled her from her thoughts. Sarah dried her hands on her apron and hurried to answer, expecting perhaps one of the ranch hands. Instead, she found a woman roughly her own age, dark-haired and serious-eyed, holding a covered basket. "Mrs. Whitmore? I'm Rebecca Chen. I work for Mr. Blackwood." The woman's voice carried a slight accent Sarah couldn't place. "I brought you some preserves and bread." "That's very kind." Sarah accepted the basket, noting the quality of the woman's simple dress and the intelligence in her gaze. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Rebecca hesitated, glancing toward the corral where Ezra's voice could be heard instructing the boys. "Perhaps for a few minutes." As Sarah prepared the coffee, she studied her visitor. Rebecca moved with quiet efficiency, her hands work-roughened but graceful. There was something in her manner, a watchfulness, that Sarah recognized in herself. "You've been with Mr. Blackwood long?" Sarah asked, settling across from Rebecca at the wooden table. 5 years. Rebecca's fingers traced the rim of her cup. "He took me and my daughter in when we had nowhere else to go." The parallel wasn't lost on Sarah. "Your husband? Dead. Murdered by men who didn't take kindly to a Chinese man marrying a white woman." Rebecca's voice remained steady, but Sarah caught the flash of old pain in her eyes. "Ezra found us hiding in his barn one winter morning. Lily was barely 2, half frozen and sick with fever. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Were you running long?" "6 months. No town would take us in. Some wouldn't even let us buy supplies." Rebecca met Sarah's gaze directly. "I know something of what you've endured." Through the window they could see Ezra lifting Pete down from the mare, the boy's face glowing with accomplishment. Tommy was attempting to mount a larger horse, while Samuel held the reins, both brothers working together in a way Sarah hadn't seen since before James died. "He's good with them," Rebecca observed. "Perhaps too good." The words slipped out before Sarah could stop them. Rebecca's expression sharpened. "You don't trust him." It wasn't a question, and Sarah found herself answering honestly. "I don't trust anyone. Can't afford to." "Smart." Rebecca sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "But you should know, whatever Ezra's faults, cruelty to children isn't among them. My Lily worships him. He taught her to read, to ride, to shoot straight. Treats her like she's his own blood. And his faults?" Sarah kept her voice carefully neutral. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "He has enemies, powerful ones. His faith, his business dealings, his politics. They all make him a target. Should I be worried for my boys? I don't know." Rebecca's honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. "But I can tell you this, whatever brought us here, whatever drives him to help women like us, it goes deeper than simple charity." Before Sarah could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Samuel burst in, face flushed with excitement. "Ma, did you see? I rode Thunder all the way around the paddock. Ezra says I'm a natural horseman just like Papa was." The casual reference to James made Sarah's breath catch. She'd barely spoken of their father since his death, too afraid of breaking down in front of the children. But here was Samuel, invoking his memory with joy rather than grief. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." She managed to keep her voice steady as she smoothed his hair. "But you should wash up now. Lunch will be ready soon." As Samuel bounded toward the wash basin, Rebecca stood to leave. At the door she turned back. "Sarah. May I call you Sarah? Be careful, but don't let fear blind you to genuine kindness. Sometimes sanctuary comes with a price, but that doesn't always make it a bad bargain." Left alone with her thoughts and the sound of her children's laughter drifting through the windows, Sarah wondered if she was strong enough to pay whatever price Ezra Blackwood might eventually demand. The storm that had threatened all afternoon finally broke, just as Sarah finished hanging the last of the laundry. Fat raindrops splattered against the dusty ground, sending up little puffs of earth that smelled like hope and renewal. She gathered the dry clothes quickly, her movements efficient from years of practice, while thunder rolled across the vast Colorado sky. Inside the small cabin Ezra had provided for them, her boys sat around the rough-hewn table, their homework spread before them in careful rows. It had been 3 weeks since their arrival at the ranch, and already she could see changes in them. Tommy's shoulders had lost their perpetual hunch, William smiled more readily, and even little James had begun to venture beyond her immediate sight without that constant fearful glancing back. "Ma, look what Mr. Ezra taught me," James called out, holding up a piece of paper covered in careful pencil marks. "It's numbers. He says I'm smart as a whip." Sarah's heart clenched at the pride in her youngest son's voice. In all their travels, no one had bothered to see intelligence in the scrawny, too-quiet boy who clung to her skirts. But Ezra had taken one look at James and somehow known. "That's wonderful, sweet boy," she said, setting the laundry basket down and moving to examine his work. The numbers were shaky but determined, and she could see Ezra's patient hand in the careful corrections, the encouraging marks beside each completed row. Through the small window, she watched Ezra emerge from the barn, his tall frame moving with that particular grace she'd come to recognize. He paused in the doorway, letting the rain wash over him for a moment before pulling his hat low and striding toward the main house. Lightning illuminated his profile, and she caught herself studying the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar where it had grown damp. She turned away quickly, busying herself with folding the clothes. Such thoughts were dangerous territory for a woman in her position. Ezra had offered them sanctuary, nothing more, and she'd be a fool to read deeper meaning into his kindnesses. Men like him, educated, prosperous, respected, didn't form attachments to desperate widows with questionable pasts and too many mouths to feed. Tommy's voice broke through her brooding. At 12, he was old enough to see too much, understand too much. Mr. Ezra said he could teach me about horses, real teaching, not just mucking stalls. May teach you, she corrected automatically. And we'll see. We can't impose on his generosity indefinitely. The words tasted bitter even as she spoke them. She'd been telling herself the same thing every night, lying in the narrow bed and listening to her sons breathe peacefully in sleep. They couldn't stay. This wasn't home, no matter how much it felt like one. But every day she delayed having that conversation with Ezra, finding excuses to put off the inevitable. William looked up from his slate, his young face serious. But where would we go, Ma? You said yourself there isn't anywhere else that'll have us. The brutal honesty of it hit her like a physical blow. From Kansas to Colorado, door after door had slammed in their faces. The widow Peterson, they called her, though that hadn't been Robert's name. Nothing about their life had been what it seemed, and the weight of those deceptions followed them like smoke from a grass fire. We'll manage, she said firmly. We always have. But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. Winter was coming, and her small savings were nearly exhausted. The work Ezra had found for her, mending, cooking for the hands, helping with accounts, paid fairly, but not enough to establish them elsewhere. She was trapped between gratitude and terror, between hope and the certainty that it would all come crashing down eventually. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She opened it to find Ezra standing in the rain, his hat dripping steadily. "Storm's getting worse," he said without preamble. "Creeks rising faster than I expected. I'd feel better if you and the boys came up to the main house tonight." Sarah hesitated, acutely aware of her sons listening to every word. "We'll be fine here. This cabin's weathered plenty of storms." "Maybe so." His dark eyes met hers steadily. "But I haven't weathered plenty of storms knowing you were down here in it. Please, Sarah, for my peace of mind if nothing else." The way he said her name, low and careful, sent warmth spreading through her chest. She nodded before she could think better of it, already turning to gather their things. As they hurried through the rain toward the big house, Ezra's hand at her elbow steadying her over the muddy ground, Sarah wondered if she was walking toward salvation or simply trading one kind of storm for another. Behind them, lightning split the sky like a warning, illuminating the path they could no longer retreat from. The morning air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as Sarah worked alongside Hannah in the kitchen, their hands moving in practiced rhythm as they prepared breakfast for the men who would soon ride out to check the cattle in the northern pasture. 3 weeks had passed since their arrival, and Sarah found herself settling into the routines of ranch life with an ease that both comforted and unsettled her. "You're troubled about something," Hannah observed, her weathered hands never pausing as she kneaded the biscuit dough. "It's written all over your face, child." Sarah glanced toward the window where she could see her boys helping Ezra mend a section of fence. Thomas had taken to the work with enthusiasm that reminded her painfully of James, while little Samuel followed his brothers with devoted determination. "They're growing attached to this place, to him, and that frightens you." It wasn't a question. Sarah set down her mixing spoon and turned to face the older woman. "Everything about this frightens me, Hannah. The kindness, the safety, the way Ezra looks at the boys like they're his own. What happens when it all falls apart?" Hannah's eyes, pale blue and knowing, studied Sarah's face. "What makes you so certain it will?" "Because good things don't last. Not for people like me." The words came out sharper than Sarah intended, edged with a bitterness she'd tried to bury. "Men don't offer sanctuary without expecting something in return. I've learned that lesson well enough. Ezra isn't other men." "No," Sarah agreed quietly. "He's not. That's what terrifies me most of all." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A group of riders crested the hill, moving at an urgent pace that set Sarah's nerves on edge. She recognized the lead rider, Bishop Crawford, the stern-faced man who had questioned her so intently upon their arrival. Ezra emerged from the barn, and even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension that straightened his shoulders as he watched the approaching party. Her boys scattered toward the house as the riders drew near, instinctively sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Inside, all of you," Ezra called, his voice carrying an authority Sarah had never heard before. "Hannah, take them to the back room." But Sarah found herself frozen at the kitchen window, watching as Bishop Crawford dismounted with military precision. His weathered face was grim as he approached Ezra, and though she couldn't hear the words exchanged, she could read the growing tension in every line of Ezra's body. "Sarah," Hannah's voice was urgent now, "come away from the window. What aren't you telling me?" Sarah turned to face the older woman, seeing fear flicker across features that had seemed unshakable. "What is this about?" Before Hannah could answer, Thomas burst through the kitchen door, his young face flushed with excitement and confusion. "Ma, there's more riders coming up the valley, lots of them." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She pushed past Thomas to the front window, her heart hammering as she counted the dust clouds rising in the distance. Too many riders, too organized. This wasn't a social call or church business. "Hannah," she whispered, "what has Ezra done?" The older woman's face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. What he thought was right, what he always does. She moved toward a cabinet Sarah had never seen opened, retrieving a rifle with practiced efficiency. But right doesn't always keep you safe in this world. Outside, the conversation between Ezra and Bishop Crawford had grown heated. Sarah could see gesturing, the rigid posture of men preparing for conflict. When Ezra suddenly looked toward the house, his eyes found hers through the window, and the expression on his face, protective, desperate, apologetic, confirmed her worst fears. "Gather the boys," she told Hannah, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Whatever this is about, we need to be ready to run." "There's no running from this," Hannah replied grimly. "Not anymore. The only way out is through." The approaching riders were close enough now that Sarah could make out individual faces, hard men with the look of those accustomed to violence. Federal marshals, she realized with a sinking heart, the kind of men who didn't make social calls on isolated Mormon ranches. Thomas appeared at her elbow, David and Samuel close behind. "Ma, what's happening? Why do you look scared?" Sarah pulled her youngest son against her side, her mind racing through possibilities and finding no good outcomes. Whatever secret Ezra had been harboring, whatever protection he'd thought his isolation could provide, it was crumbling around them all. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered, watching as more armed men positioned themselves around the ranch buildings. "But whatever happens, you boys stay close to me. Do you understand?" Through the window, she saw Ezra's shoulders square as he faced the approaching storm, and despite her fear, despite the certainty that their sanctuary was about to become a battleground, Sarah felt her heart break for the man who had given them everything he could. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Sarah watched Elijah work with her boys near the corral. 2 weeks had passed since their arrival, and she'd begun to notice things, small details that didn't quite align with the simple rancher he claimed to be. His hands, for instance. Though calloused from honest work, they moved with a precision that spoke of education, of refinement carefully hidden beneath the rough exterior. When he thought no one was watching, she'd caught him reading a leather-bound book written in what looked like Latin. And yesterday, when a rider had approached the property line, Elijah's entire demeanor had shifted, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip with the fluid motion of someone who'd done it countless times before. "Mama, look!" Tommy's excited voice drew her from her thoughts. Her youngest son was sitting atop the gentlest mare, Elijah's steady hand on the reins, guiding the horse in slow circles. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she called back, but her eyes remained fixed on Elijah. Who was this man who'd taken them in so readily? What was he running from or hiding? Later that afternoon, While the boys napped and Elijah tended to the cattle, Sarah found herself alone in the main house. She told herself she was simply looking for extra linens, but her feet carried her toward Elijah's study. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see the desk where he kept his correspondence. Her conscience warred with her curiosity. He'd shown them nothing but kindness, yet her maternal instincts demanded answers. What if he was dangerous? What if staying here put her children at risk? The floorboard creaked under her weight as she stepped inside. The room smelled of leather and tobacco, with an underlying scent of sage from the open window. Books lined the walls, far more than any simple rancher would need. Philosophy, theology, law texts that looked well used. On the desk, a half-finished letter lay beneath a brass paperweight. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the letterhead. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Salt Lake City. But it was the salutation that made her heart race. Brother Matthias. Matthias, not Elijah. Her hands trembled as she read further, though she knew she shouldn't. The letter spoke of your situation and continued discretion and the safety of the community. It was signed by someone identified only as Bishop Reynolds, Sarah. She spun around, the letter fluttering from her hands. Elijah, Matthias, stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She waited for anger, for accusations, but instead he simply stepped into the room and carefully picked up the fallen correspondence. "I suppose you have questions," he said quietly, settling the letter back on his desk. "Your name isn't Elijah. It wasn't a question. No, it's Matthias Webb." He moved to the window, gazing out at the mountains. "Though I haven't used that name in some time." "Why?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. When he finally turned back to her, she saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "Because Matthias Webb was supposed to marry Brigham Young's niece in a political arrangement that would have secured my family's standing in the church hierarchy. Because when I refused, I became an embarrassment to men who don't tolerate embarrassment well." His voice carried a weight of old pain. "Because sometimes doing what's right means losing everything you thought you wanted." Sarah sank into the chair beside his desk, her legs suddenly unsteady. "Are you in danger?" "Possibly. The church has a long reach, and men like Bishop Reynolds don't forget perceived slights." He studied her face carefully. "Are you afraid?" The honest answer was yes, but not for the reasons he might expect. She was afraid of how safe she felt here, how natural it seemed to watch him with her boys, how her heart quickened when he smiled. She was afraid of caring for a man whose past might reach out to destroy the fragile peace they'd found. "Should I be? I've tried to build something good here, Sarah, something honest. But I won't lie to you, my past could complicate things. If you want to leave, I'll give you money, supplies, whatever you need to make a fresh start somewhere else." Outside, she could hear her boys' laughter as they played in the yard, the sound bright and carefree in a way it hadn't been since their father's death. Here they were safe, fed, happy. Here she'd begun to remember what it felt like to be a woman, not just a desperate mother fighting for survival. "What happens if they find you?" His jaw tightened. "I won't let anything happen to you or the boys. You have my word." Sarah rose slowly, her decision crystallizing with each heartbeat. Whatever secrets Matthias carried, whatever danger might be lurking in their shared past, she'd faced worse odds and survived, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could face whatever came next together. "Then I suppose," she said, meeting his gaze steadily, "we'd better make sure they don't find you." The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn as Sarah stepped inside, her breath visible in the crisp air. She'd come looking for Matthew, who'd been spending more time with the animals lately, seeking solace among creatures that didn't judge or whisper behind closed doors. Instead, she found Ezekiel alone, methodically checking the horse's hooves. He looked up at her approach, and she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened slightly. "Morning," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter around herself. "Sarah." He straightened, setting down his tools. "The boys are helping Rebecca with breakfast. Matthew seemed better today." She nodded, grateful for his careful attention to her children's moods. Over the past weeks, she'd watched him navigate their grief with a patience that both touched and puzzled her. There were depths to this man she couldn't fathom. "Ezekiel, I need to ask you something." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "About your family, your wives." His hands stilled on the horse's bridle. "What about them? The way people in town look at us, at you. I need to understand what I've brought my children into." He was quiet for so long she wondered if he'd answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her chest tighten. "I was married to 3 women, yes. Mary, Elizabeth, and Ruth." He moved to the next stall, his movements deliberate. "Mary died giving birth to our daughter, who lived only 2 days. Elizabeth? She left one winter, took the stage to her sisters in California, said she couldn't bear the isolation anymore." Sarah watched the play of emotions across his face, seeing pain he rarely allowed to surface. "And Ruth?" "Ruth stayed the longest, 5 years. But there were no children, and she grew to resent what she called my stubborn faith in a God who gave us nothing but hardship." He paused, his hand resting on the stall door. "She left 3 years ago to marry a shopkeeper in Denver, a man who could give her a normal life." The barn fell silent except for the soft shuffling of animals. Sarah stepped closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his voice. "The church, they don't approve of me anymore," he continued. "A man who can't keep his wives, who lives alone on the outskirts, who takes in strangers." He looked at her then, his eyes holding hers. "They think I've lost my way. Have you?" A bitter smile touched his lips. "Maybe. Or maybe I've found it." Before she could ask what he meant, the barn door burst open. Thomas rushed in, his face flushed with excitement. Ma, come quick. There's riders coming up the road." Sarah's blood chilled. Riders meant trouble. It always did. She followed Thomas outside, Ezekiel close behind her, and saw the dust cloud in the distance. "How many?" Ezekiel asked, shading his eyes against the sun. 3, maybe 4, Thomas replied, bouncing on his toes with nervous energy. As the riders drew closer, Sarah recognized the lead horse, and her heart sank. Sheriff Morrison from Clearwater, the last town that had turned them away. Behind him rode 2 men she didn't recognize, their badges glinting in the morning light. "Sarah, take the boys inside," Ezekiel said quietly, but she shook her head. "They're here for me. Whatever this is, running will only make it worse." The riders pulled up in front of the house, just as Rebecca emerged from the kitchen, little David and Matthew flanking her. Sarah saw the way Matthew instinctively moved closer to Ezekiel, seeking protection from the man who'd become an anchor in his turbulent world. Sheriff Morrison dismounted slowly, his weathered face grim. "Ms. Harper." "Sheriff." She lifted her chin, summoning courage she didn't feel. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Official business, I'm afraid." He glanced at Ezekiel with obvious distaste. "Got word from Kansas. Seems there's been some questions raised about your husband's death." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Questions?" His brother's been talking to folks, suggesting maybe all wasn't as it seemed. Claims James had money hidden away, money that went missing after he died. Sarah's hands began to shake. "That's not. There was no money. We lost everything. That's why we left." "Maybe so, but we got to investigate proper like." Morrison's eyes shifted between her and Ezekiel. "Course. Heard you been living here in sin with this Mormon fellow, which don't help your case none." Ezekiel stepped forward, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "Mrs. Harper is under my protection, Sheriff. She and her children have done nothing wrong." Morrison spat in the dirt. "Protection, you call it? From what I hear tell, you Mormons got your own ideas about women and marriage." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire, ready to consume everything Sarah had tried to build for her children in this place that had finally felt like home. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke as Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Jacob work with the horses in the distance. Rain lashed against the glass, distorting his figure into wavering shadows. She pressed her palm against the cool pane, her breath fogging the surface as thunder rolled across the valley. 3 weeks had passed since that night in the barn, and everything between them had shifted like sand beneath her feet. Jacob had grown distant, polite in a way that felt worse than anger. He spoke to her only when necessary, his eyes carefully avoiding hers during meals. The boys had noticed too. Even little Thomas had asked why Mr. Jacob seemed sad. The front door burst open, and Samuel stumbled inside, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. "Mama, there's riders coming up the road. A whole bunch of them." Sarah's blood turned cold. She grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace, her hands surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Get your brothers. Take them to the root cellar and don't come out until I tell you." "But Mama—" "Now." Samuel. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see them now. 6 men on horseback, their faces obscured by hat brims and weather. They moved with purpose, not seeking shelter from the storm. Her throat tightened as she recognized the lead rider's distinctive grey coat, even before he pushed back his hood. Marcus Harwell. She should have known he wouldn't give up. Men like him never did, especially when their pride had been wounded. The fact that he'd tracked them this far, through multiple states and into Utah territory, spoke to a determination that chilled her to the bone. The riders stopped in front of the house, their horses stamping and snorting in the downpour. Harwell dismounted and approached the porch, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. Sarah cracked the door open, keeping the rifle visible but not quite pointed at him. "Mrs. Collins." His voice carried that same smooth confidence she remembered, though his eyes held something harder now. "You've led us quite a chase. This is private property, Mr. Harwell. You're not welcome here." He smiled, rainwater dripping from his hat brim. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You see, you have something that belongs to me. I have nothing of yours. Your late husband's debt says otherwise." He produced a folded document from his coat, keeping it partially shielded from the rain. Legal and binding, signed, witnessed, and now due in full. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice level. James never mentioned any such debt. Perhaps he was ashamed. Men often are when they lose more than they can afford in poker. Harwell's smile widened. "The amount has grown considerably with interest and expenses for tracking you down. But I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to accept alternative payment." The implication in his words made her skin crawl. She raised the rifle slightly. "Get off this land." "Now, Mrs. Collins, there's no need for unpleasantness. I have legal documents, and the territorial marshal will uphold them. Of course, if you prefer to handle this privately." His gaze swept over her in a way that made her want to scrub her skin raw. "She told you to leave." Jacob's voice cut through the rain like a blade. Sarah turned to see him approaching from the barn, his own rifle cradled in his arms. Water streamed from his hat and coat, but his stride was unhurried, controlled. Behind him, she glimpsed movement, more figures emerging from the outbuildings. Harwell's confidence flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "This is between me and the lady. I suggest you mind your own business, friend." "This is my land," Jacob said, stepping onto the porch beside Sarah. "That makes it my business." "Your land?" Harwell's eyes narrowed as he studied Jacob more carefully, taking in the simple clothes, the beard, the quiet authority in his bearing. "Ah, one of you Mormons." He spoke the word like something distasteful. "I hear you people have interesting arrangements when it comes to women." Sarah felt Jacob tense beside her, though his expression never changed. "You have 10 seconds to mount up and ride out. I have legal claim. This is Utah territory, our laws, our courts." Jacob's voice carried quiet finality. "Your papers mean nothing here, and you know it." For a long moment the only sounds were the drumming rain and the creak of leather as horses shifted restlessly. Harwell's men looked increasingly uncomfortable, water running off their slickers in rivulets. Finally, Harwell folded the document and tucked it away. "This isn't over, Mrs. Collins. I've invested too much to walk away empty-handed." His eyes shifted to Jacob. "And you might want to ask your protector here about his own past debts before you trust him too completely." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounting with deliberate slowness. The riders wheeled away into the storm, but Sarah knew with cold certainty that they hadn't gone far. Men like Harwell didn't travel hundreds of miles just to be turned away by harsh words and territorial boundaries. As the hoofbeats faded into the rain, she became aware that Jacob was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for days finally broke just after midnight, sending Catherine from her bed to check the windows. Rain lashed against the glass in sheets, and lightning illuminated the ranch in stark, violent flashes. She pulled her shawl tighter and moved through the house, ensuring the boys were still sleeping peacefully despite the thunder. As she passed the front window, a flash of lightning revealed a figure on horseback approaching through the downpour. Her heart seized. No one traveled in weather like this unless driven by desperation or danger. She watched as the rider dismounted near the barn, leading his horse inside before emerging and running toward the house. The knock came soft but urgent. Catherine hesitated only a moment before opening the door to find a young man barely past 20, soaked to the bone and shivering. Water streamed from his dark hair, and his eyes held the wild look of someone who had ridden hard through the night. "Ma'am," he gasped, removing his hat, "I'm looking for Ezra Whitmore. Is this his ranch?" "It is. Come inside before you catch your death." She stepped aside, noting how his gaze darted nervously around the room. "Mr. Whitmore isn't here presently. Perhaps I can help you?" The young man's face fell. "When will he return?" It's urgent." Before Catherine could answer, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Samuel appeared, having been awakened by the commotion. His hair was disheveled from sleep, but his eyes were alert as he took in the scene. "Jacob?" Samuel's voice held surprise and something else, concern. "What are you doing here?" The young man, Jacob, looked between Catherine and Samuel with obvious confusion. "Brother Whitmore, I need to speak with you privately. There's trouble in Salt Lake." Catherine felt the familiar chill of secrets being kept from her. She started to excuse herself, but Samuel's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Morrison can hear whatever you have to say. We keep no secrets in this house." The words were clearly meant for her, but Jacob looked uncomfortable. He glanced at Catherine again before speaking. "The federal marshals came through last week. They're asking questions about you, about why you left so suddenly. Brother Young wants you to return immediately." Samuel's jaw tightened. What kind of questions?" "About the woman and children you're harboring, about whether you've abandoned your duties to the church." Jacob's voice dropped lower. "They know about your first wife, Samuel. They know about Rebecca." The name hung in the air like a physical presence. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. Samuel's expression had gone carefully blank, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "My first wife died 5 years ago," Samuel said quietly. "There's nothing to hide about Rebecca." Jacob shook his head. "That's not what they're saying in town. There are rumors, people saying she didn't die, that she ran off, that maybe you—" He stopped abruptly, seeming to remember Catherine's presence. "That maybe— I what?" Samuel's voice was dangerously low. "That maybe you had reason to want her gone." The silence that followed was broken only by the continued assault of rain against the windows. Catherine found herself studying Samuel's face, looking for any sign of the man she thought she knew, the kind rancher who had given her family sanctuary, who had shown her sons patience and gentleness, who had kissed her with such tenderness just days before. "Get out," Samuel said finally. Jacob blinked. "Brother Whitmore, I'm only telling you what—" "I said get out. You can shelter in the barn until the storm passes. Then I want you off my land." "But Brother Young's message—" "Tell Brigham Young that I answer to God, not to gossips and federal marshals. And tell him that if he has questions about my past, he can come ask me himself." Jacob looked as if he wanted to argue further, but something in Samuel's expression stopped him. He nodded reluctantly, put his hat back on his wet head, and moved toward the door. "I'm sorry to have disturbed you, ma'am," he said to Catherine, before slipping back into the storm. When the door closed behind him, Catherine found herself alone with Samuel and a dozen new questions that she wasn't sure she wanted answered. The man she had been falling in love with suddenly felt like a stranger. "Catherine," Samuel began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't. Not tonight. Whatever you need to tell me, it can wait until morning." She moved toward the stairs, then paused. "But Samuel, no more secrets. Whatever the truth is about Rebecca, about your past, I need to know. My boy's safety depends on it." He nodded, looking older than she had ever seen him. "You're right. No more secrets." As she climbed the stairs, Catherine wondered if that promise would save them or destroy everything they had built together. The storm hit 3 days after Samuel's return, bringing with it a fury that seemed to shake the very foundation of the ranch house. Ruth stood at the kitchen window, watching the snow whip across the yard in violent spirals, obscuring everything beyond 20 feet. The boys huddled near the fireplace, their usual energy subdued by the howling wind that rattled the shutters like ghostly fingers. Samuel moved through the house with quiet efficiency, checking windows and securing loose items, but Ruth could feel the tension radiating from him. He'd been different since his return from town, more watchful, more careful with his words. Whatever news he'd received had settled into the lines around his eyes like winter shadows. "Mama, when will it stop?" Thomas asked, pressing closer to her skirts as another gust shook the house. "Soon, sweetheart," she murmured, though the grey wall of snow suggested otherwise. She'd lived through Kansas winters, but this Colorado storm felt different, wilder, more unforgiving. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face grave. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "Privately." Ruth's stomach clenched. She settled the boys with their books near the fire and followed Samuel to his study, where the warmth barely penetrated the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He closed the door and turned to face her, his hands clasped behind his back. "The men who came asking about you, they're not just looking anymore. They've been granted authority to search properties." "What kind of authority?" "Federal marshals. They claim you're wanted for questioning in connection with your husband's debts." Samuel's jaw tightened. Debts that apparently involve some very dangerous people. Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. "I told you, I don't know anything about William's business dealings." "I believe you." His voice was gentle but firm. "But they don't seem inclined to take your word for it. According to what I heard in town, they think William hid something before he died. Something valuable enough to make these men very persistent." The room seemed to spin around her. Ruth gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "What does this mean for us? For my boys?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke, his words carried a weight that made her heart pound. "There's something else you need to know, about why I was really willing to help you." Ruth's breath caught. She'd sensed there were depths to Samuel Thorne that he kept carefully hidden, but the gravity in his voice now frightened her more than the storm outside. "My first wife. She wasn't just sick when she died. She was running from someone too, a man back in Missouri who claimed she belonged to him." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "I thought I could protect her by bringing her here, by giving her a new name, a new life. But the isolation, the constant fear of being found, it ate away at her until there was nothing left." Ruth stared at him, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly falling into place. "You think I'm going to end up the same way?" "Not if I can help it." The fierce determination in his voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. "But this time, things have to be different. No more secrets between us. No more half-truths." "What are you saying?" Samuel moved closer, close enough that she could see the storm clouds gathering in his grey eyes. "I'm saying that if we're going to survive this, really survive it, we need to trust each other completely. And that means you need to know everything about who I really am." The wind chose that moment to slam against the house with renewed fury, making them both jump. In the sudden silence that followed, Ruth could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Tell me," she whispered. "Samuel Thorne is the name I took when I came to Colorado. But before that, I was someone else, someone with connections to people who don't ask questions and don't leave loose ends." His eyes never left hers, people who could make certain men disappear permanently. Ruth felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The gentle rancher who'd shown such kindness to her boys, who'd treated her with such careful respect, what was he really capable of? "You're scaring me," she said honestly. "Good, you should be scared, but not of me." Samuel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers brushed against her cheek with heartbreaking tenderness. "Ruth, I won't let them take you. I won't let them hurt your boys, but you need to understand. Once we go down this path, there's no going back to the life we've been pretending to live here." Outside, the storm raged with increasing violence, as if the very elements were responding to the moment that would change everything between them forever. The letter arrived with the morning supply wagon, its edges worn from the long journey. Sarah recognized the careful script immediately, her sister's handwriting, though more hurried than usual. She stepped away from the barn where she'd been helping Ezra mend harnesses, her heart already racing before she broke the seal. "Sarah," it began, "word has reached us here in Independence about your circumstances. Father is beside himself with worry, and Mother hasn't stopped weeping since we heard. We're sending money with this letter, enough for train passage for you and the boys. Come home immediately. Whatever scandal you've created out there can be weathered here among family." The paper trembled in Sarah's hands. Scandal. They thought she'd brought this on herself somehow, that her desperation had led to disgrace. The money fell to the dirt, more than she'd seen in months, enough to take her sons back to the suffocating certainty of her father's house. "Bad news?" Ezra's voice was quiet behind her. She turned, seeing the concern in his weathered features, the way his hands stilled on the leather he'd been working. Beyond him, the ranch spread out in the morning light. The house where her boys slept safely, the fields where they ran without fear, the corrals where they'd learned to gentle horses under his patient guidance. "My family wants us to come home." She held up the letter, watching his face carefully. "They've sent money." Something flickered in his dark eyes. Not surprise, but resignation, as if he'd been expecting this moment, preparing for it. "That's good," he said slowly. "Security, respectability." "Is it?" The words escaped before she could stop them. "Going back to being my father's burden, my boys raised to believe they're lesser because their father failed, having every decision made for me until I'm nothing but a shadow in someone else's house?" Ezra set down the harness, his movements deliberate. "You'd be safe there." "Safe," she laughed bitterly. "Do you know what safety cost me before? I was safe in my first marriage, safe and dying by inches. My husband was respectable, God-fearing, everything my parents wanted. He was also cruel in small ways, constant ways that left no marks anyone could see. The admission hung between them like smoke." She'd never spoken those words aloud, not even to herself in the darkest hours after Thomas died. But something about Ezra's stillness, his complete attention, drew the truth from her. "The boys don't know," she continued. "They remember him as stern but just. I've let them keep that. But I won't go back to that kind of safety, not for me, not for them." Ezra stepped closer, his boots careful on the uneven ground. "Sarah, you need to understand something. The offer I made you, marriage, it wasn't born from desperation or charity. I've watched you these months, seen how you've brought life to this place, how you've made it feel like more than just land and buildings." Her breath caught. "Ezra, let me finish." His voice was rough. "I know what folks say about men like me, about our arrangements. Some of it's true, but what I'm offering you isn't duty or obligation. It's partnership, a real marriage, if you'll have it, if you'll have me." The morning sun painted everything golden, his face, the mountains beyond, the money scattered at her feet. Sarah felt the moment crystallizing, becoming one of those choices that would echo through every day that followed. "My boys come first," she said quietly. Always. I'd expect nothing less. They're good boys, Sarah. Strong and kind. I'd be proud to call them mine. The church, your bishop. Let me worry about Bishop Crawford. I've stood on my own in this valley for 15 years. I won't bend now, not for him or anyone else. Sarah knelt and gathered the scattered bills, feeling their weight, not just the money, but what they represented. The easy path, the expected choice, the return to a life that would slowly strangle her spirit. She straightened, meeting Ezra's gaze. "If I stay," she said, "if we do this thing, I need to know all of it. The troubles with the church, whatever you've been protecting me from. No more secrets." Something shifted in his expression, relief mixed with apprehension. "There's a meeting tonight. Crawford's calling in the council, and I suspect my name will feature prominently in the discussion. You should know what you're choosing before you choose it. Then I'll be there." "Sarah, it's not your fight. If I'm to be your wife, your partner, then your fights are mine." She folded the money carefully, slipping it into her pocket. "I'll write to my sister. Tell her we're grateful for the offer, but that we've found our home." Ezra's smile was slow, transforming his entire face. "Are you certain?" Sarah looked toward the house where her sons were waking, where breakfast waited and another day of building their life together stretched ahead. "I've never been more certain of anything." The storm that had been threatening all week finally broke over the valley, turning the world into a sheet of silver rain. Sarah pressed her face to the kitchen window, watching the water cascade off the barn roof in thick streams. Inside, she could hear the boys playing with wooden horses Caleb had carved for them, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the thunder rolling across the mountains. She'd been avoiding him for 3 days now, ever since that moment in the pasture when something had shifted between them, like tectonic plates finding new ground. The memory of his hand brushing hers as he'd helped her down from the fence post sent heat spiraling through her chest, and she pressed her palms against the cool glass to steady herself. The kitchen door opened behind her, bringing with it the scent of rain and leather. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Caleb. She'd grown to recognize the quiet way he moved, the particular rhythm of his breathing. "Roads will be washed out for days," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Good thing we got the cattle moved to higher ground yesterday." Sarah nodded, still facing the window. In the reflection, she could see him watching her, water dripping from his dark hair onto the wooden floor. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the words they hadn't spoken. "Sarah." His voice was softer now, uncertain in a way that made her chest tighten. "Have I done something to upset you?" She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her own cowardice. For 3 days, she'd hidden behind chores and the children, terrified of what she might see in his face, or worse, what he might see in hers. After months of carefully guarded friendship, she'd let herself imagine impossible things, and the wanting was becoming too large to contain. "No," she whispered. "You've done nothing wrong." His footsteps crossed the floor until she could feel the warmth of him behind her. When his reflection appeared beside hers in the glass, she saw the confusion in his eyes, the careful concern he always showed when one of the boys was hurt or frightened. "Then why won't you look at me?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the mountains in stark detail before plunging them back into grey twilight. Sarah turned slowly, finally meeting his gaze, and felt something crack open in her chest at what she found there. He wasn't looking at her like she was a responsibility or a burden to be managed. The expression on his face was raw, unguarded, the look of a man barely holding himself together. "Because I'm afraid," she admitted, the words scraping her throat raw. "Of me? Of this?" She gestured helplessly between them. "Of wanting something I have no right to want." Caleb stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow that she'd wondered about but never asked. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What if I told you I've been afraid of the same thing?" Her breath caught. "Caleb!" "I know what people would say. A Mormon rancher and a widow with 3 children. I know it's complicated, know there are things about my life you don't understand yet. His hand rose as if to touch her face, then fell back to his side. But Sarah, what I feel for you, it's not complicated at all. Thunder crashed overhead, and somewhere in the house little Michael called out. They both froze, listening, but Thomas's voice followed, soothing his younger brother back to sleep. The ordinary sounds of family life seemed to anchor them both, reminding Sarah of everything that had led them to this moment. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to let myself care about someone again. You think I do? A smile ghosted across his lips. Sarah, I've spent the last 10 years convinced I was better off alone. Then you and the boys showed up, and suddenly my house felt like a home instead of just a place to sleep. Rain lashed against the windows with renewed fury, as if the storm was trying to break down the walls around them. Sarah thought of all the towns that had turned them away, all the doors that had closed in her face, and how this man had opened his home without question or judgment. The church elders are coming next month, Caleb said quietly. There are things I need to tell them, decisions to make about my future here, but I wanted you to know, whatever happens, these months with you and the boys have been the best of my life. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from joy or sorrow she couldn't say. Outside the storm raged on, but inside this kitchen something precious and fragile was taking root, despite all the reasons it shouldn't. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Ezra load supplies into the wagon. 3 days had passed since his confession about Rachel and the children he'd lost, and something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained had dissolved into something deeper, more honest. Ma, can we ride with Mr. Ezra to town? Tommy's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to find all 3 boys clustered in the doorway, their faces bright with anticipation. The transformation in them over these past months still amazed her. They'd grown taller, stronger, their cheeks filled out from regular meals, and their eyes clear of the haunted look that had followed them from Kansas. Not today, she said gently. Mr. Ezra has business to attend to. What kind of business? Ben asked, always the curious one. Sarah glanced toward the window again. She'd wondered the same thing. Ezra had been unusually quiet at breakfast, his jaw set in that particular way that meant trouble was brewing. He'd received a letter yesterday from town, and whatever it contained had left him grim-faced and distant. Adult business, she replied, the standard answer that usually satisfied them. But as the boys reluctantly headed outside to tend their chores, Sarah found herself unable to shake her unease. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch just as Ezra approached. You're troubled, she said, studying his face. He paused at the bottom of the steps, his hat in his hands. There's been talk in town about us, about you and the boys being here. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What kind of talk? The kind that could cause problems. He looked out toward the mountains, his expression hard. Some folks are saying it isn't proper, a widow woman living on a bachelor's ranch. Others are questioning why I'd take in outsiders when there are local families in need. And some are wondering about your faith, Sarah added quietly, understanding more than he was saying. He nodded grimly. There's a territorial representative coming through next week. He's been asking questions about land grants, about who has claim to what properties. My lawyer thinks someone's been talking to him. Sarah sank onto the porch step, her legs suddenly unsteady. She'd known this peace couldn't last forever. Nothing good in her life ever did. There's more, Ezra continued, his voice gentle but firm. The bank examiner found irregularities in James's accounts. Money that was moved before he died, debts that were hidden. They're saying his death might not have been the accident everyone thought. The words hit her like a physical blow. What are you saying? I'm saying there are people who think James took his own life rather than face what was coming. And if that's true, if they can prove it, he trailed off, but she understood. If James had killed himself, it would validate every cruel word spoken about him, every door slammed in her face. It would make her and the boys pariahs forever. "I don't believe it," she whispered, but even as she said the words, doubt crept in. James had been so distant those final weeks, so secretive about his business dealings. She'd attributed it to stress, to the pressure of providing for a growing family. But what if there had been more? Ezra climbed the steps and sat beside her. What you believe doesn't matter to them. They want someone to blame, someone to punish, and a dead man's family makes an easy target. Sarah stared at her hands, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness settling over her shoulders. "So what do we do?" "I'm going to town to meet with my lawyer and the sheriff. We're going to get ahead of this before it gets worse." He paused, then reached for her hand. "But Sarah, you need to be prepared. If this goes badly, if they decide to pursue charges or invalidate James's accounts, they could come after everything, including this ranch. How?" "This is your land." His silence stretched too long, and when she looked up, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "The land grant was conditional," he said finally. "Part of a program to encourage settlement. If I'm found to be harboring fugitives or associated with criminal activity, even by marriage or partnership, they can revoke it." The full scope of what he was risking for them hit her like a thunderbolt. Not just his reputation or his standing in the community, but everything he'd built, everything he owned. "Ezra, no." She stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch. "You can't lose everything because of us. I won't let that happen." He rose and caught her arm, turning her to face him. "That's not your decision to make, isn't it? This is my past catching up with us, my burden to bear." "Our burden," he corrected firmly. "We're in this together now, Sarah, all of us." From the barn came the sound of her boys' laughter, carefree and innocent. They had no idea their world was about to shatter again. The dawn light filtered through the cabin windows as Sarah finished packing the last of their belongings into 2 worn satchels. Her hands trembled as she folded Samuel's favorite shirt, the one with the tiny horses embroidered on the collar. 3 days had passed since Marshal Hendricks delivered his ultimatum, and the weight of impossible choices pressed down on her shoulders like a millstone. "Ma?" Tommy appeared in the doorway, his 8-year-old face creased with worry. "Why are we packing again?" Sarah's heart clenched. How could she explain that their sanctuary had become a trap, that the man who'd shown them such kindness was now asking her to choose between her sons and their safety? "We might need to take a trip, sweetheart, but I don't want to leave. This is home now." His voice cracked, and Sarah pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his hair. "I know, baby. I know." Heavy footsteps on the porch announced Ezra's arrival. He entered without knocking, a liberty that once felt natural but now seemed presumptuous. His face was haggard, deep lines etched around his eyes, as if he'd aged years in mere days. "Sarah," his voice was rough, "we need to talk." She nodded toward the bedroom where little James still slept. "Boys, go check on your brother." When they were alone, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Ezra ran his hands through his dark hair, the gesture achingly familiar. "I've been thinking," he began, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with his words. "About what the marshal said, about the choice." "There is no choice, Ezra." Sarah's voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I won't sacrifice one of my children for the others. What if there was another way?" Something in his tone made her look up sharply. He was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I could take Samuel, disappear with him. The marshal would have what he wants, leverage over me, but the boy would be safe, hidden." Ezra stepped closer. "There are places in the mountains, old mining camps, where a man and a boy could live quietly. I know people who would help." "No." The word burst from her lips before she could stop it. "Absolutely not. Sarah, listen." "No, you listen." She whirled to face him fully, her eyes blazing. "I've lost one husband. I will not lose a son, and I will not let you sacrifice yourself for my mistakes." "Your mistakes?" Ezra's voice rose slightly. "What mistakes? Loving your children? Trying to protect them? Trusting the wrong people? Believing I could outrun the past? Her voice broke. I should have kept running when we first arrived. Should have known that happiness like this was too good to last. It doesn't have to end. Doesn't it? She laughed bitterly. Look around you, Ezra. Everything you've built, everything you've worked for, it's all at risk because of us. Because of me. He crossed the small space between them in 2 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. Do you think I care about any of that? The ranch, the cattle, the reputation I've built here, none of it matters without you. Without your boys. The naked emotion in his voice made her knees weak. You don't mean that. I've never meant anything more in my life. His thumbs traced small circles on her arms through the fabric of her dress. I love you, Sarah. I love Tommy's endless questions and Samuel's quiet wisdom and the way little James laughs when I toss him in the air. You've all become the family I never thought I'd have. Tears spilled down her cheeks. And that's exactly why I can't let you destroy yourself for us. Then what? You'll just leave, take the boys and disappear into nothing? His grip tightened slightly. Where will you go? What kind of life will that be for them? She pulled away from his touch, wrapping her arms around herself. I don't know, but at least they'll be alive, and you'll be safe. Safe and miserable, safe and empty. Ezra's voice dropped to a whisper. Is that really what you want? Before she could answer, a commotion erupted outside. Horses approaching fast, too many of them. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the sound, the thundering hooves that had haunted her nightmares for months. Ezra was already moving toward the window, his body tense. Stay back! Through the glass, Sarah could see them. Marshal Hendricks and at least 6 men, all armed, surrounding the cabin. But it was the figure riding slightly behind them that made her legs give out completely. William Garrett, Samuel's father. The man whose money and influence had been hunting them across 3 states. He'd found them at last. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Sarah stood on the porch, watching her boys help Ezra with the horses. 3 months had passed since the confrontation with Bishop Hawthorne, and the rhythm of their new life had settled into something approaching peace. Yet she could feel change coming like a storm on the horizon. "Mama, look!" Tommy called out, successfully leading one of the mares to water. At 8, he'd grown confident around the animals, his earlier fears forgotten. James and little Peter worked nearby, their laughter echoing across the meadow. Ezra emerged from the barn, his shirt damp with sweat, that familiar smile warming his weathered features. In the months since his excommunication, he'd seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But Sarah worried about the cost of his sacrifice. The church council sent another letter, she said as he approached, pulling the envelope from her apron pocket. They'd been arriving weekly, formal documents demanding his return, threatening eternal consequences. Each one went straight into the fire. Ezra barely glanced at it. Let them write their letters. I've made my choice. But your eternal soul... My soul belongs to God, not to men who would cast out children for the sins they imagine their fathers committed. He took her hands, calloused thumbs tracing circles on her palms. I've found my heaven right here, Sarah. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. Over the months, their relationship had deepened into something she'd never experienced, not even with her first husband. This was partnership, understanding, a love built on shared struggles and quiet moments. Yet she'd held part of herself back, afraid to fully commit to a man whose world was so different from her own. There's something else, she said, retrieving a second letter. From my sister in California. She says there are opportunities there, jobs for women, schools for the boys, a fresh start. Ezra's hands stilled. Is that what you want? The question hung between them, loaded with months of unspoken possibilities. Sarah looked out at her sons, thriving in ways she'd never imagined possible. When they'd first arrived, they'd been hollow-eyed and fearful. Now they were strong, confident, part of something larger than themselves. I don't know, she admitted. 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. Safety for my boys, a place to belong. You gave us that, Ezra, but you're afraid of what staying might cost you. His voice held no judgment, only understanding. Sarah, I need you to know something. Whatever happened between your husband and the church, whatever shadows you've been running from, none of it matters to me. What matters is the woman you are, the mother you are, the life we could build together. Tears stung her eyes. She'd carried the weight of John's gambling debts, his association with men who'd robbed a church fund, for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen for herself alone. The boys think of you as their father now, she whispered, and I think of them as my sons. But I won't trap you here with obligations, Sarah. If you need to go... She silenced him with a kiss, sudden and fierce, pouring months of carefully guarded emotion into the contact. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. I don't want to go, she said. I want to stay. I want to marry you and build a life here, but I need to know we're choosing each other freely, not out of necessity or gratitude. Then marry me, Ezra said, dropping to one knee right there on the porch. Not because you need protection, or because I saved you from the road. Marry me because you love me, because you want to wake up next to me for the rest of our lives, because you believe in what we're building together. The boys had noticed the commotion and came running, their excited voices carrying across the yard. Sarah looked down at this good man, this gentle soul who'd sacrificed everything for strangers and felt the last of her walls crumble. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you. The boys reached them just as Ezra swept her into his arms, their cheers adding to the joyful chaos. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. But here in this valley, everything was new. They would face whatever challenges came, the church's disapproval, the harsh winters, the uncertainties of frontier life, but they would face them together. As the sun climbed higher, casting the world in golden light, Sarah finally understood that sometimes the end of one story was simply the beginning of another. They'd found their sanctuary at last, not in a place but in each other, and it was enough. It was everything.